I wonder if the Premier League missed the trick by not putting the selling of assets to PSR, for PSR, to a vote. Last week, ahead of an AGM, the Premier League consulted with clubs on a proposal to hold a vote on a rule change to block the revenue generated from the selling of assets to be included in PSR calculations. But clubs rejected this and decided not to put it to a vote. A lot of this centres around Chelsea back in 2023, the selling of 2 hotels, when I think you thought, like everybody else, they might be in a little bit of trouble here, and then they found somehow hotels and women's team and a couple of sheds to sell for 200 million quid, which helped them bring themselves in line with PSR.
Yeah. Well, look, we knew about the situation with the women's team in April of 2024. So we talked about it a million times that they were spending a lot of money that they could not afford from a PSR perspective, unless they were either going to sell players or something else. And they decided, first of all, to sell some hotels to themselves, and then realised that they could also sell the women's team to themselves. Now, the vote for that occurred on June the 4th, I think it was, last season, 2024. They didn't carry out the change until the end of June. So in plain sight, the clubs allowed them, the rest of the clubs in the Premier League allowed them to do it. So nobody can complain after they put it to a vote, failed to get the drafting right in terms of what the drafting should look like in the rules to stop the sale of an asset to yourself, and then not come back to the clubs to try and put the rule in with some amendments when it fails to get through. So nobody can complain about it. And of course, the moment that it happened, PSR was dead. I mean, I don't think there's any question now that it would be an unbelievably foolish club to fail PSR when you have this as your ripcord in the worst case scenario. So PSR in its current form, although it persists for next season, is dead. And
why? Because you can sell the garden shed to yourself for 100 million quid.
Look, if Chelsea women's team is worth £250 million, which is the approximate post value that's been put on it by the minority sale, or 200 as they put it through their books, all of the value in the women's team that justifies 200 million is about what the women's game looks like in 2050. It's not about what it looks like in 2025. It's irrelevant that in the formative years of the women's game, Chelsea won a few trophies, because it's all about the future value. So if it's all about the future value of a top football club franchise in the women's game, well, that applies to almost any Premier League club, regardless of their current size.
So it's open season.
It's open season. So I would say even a club like Newcastle or Everton or Aston Villa, all of those women's teams are worth over £100 million on the Chelsea valuation metrics, because it's not about what they've won so far, or about the revenue, or about the profit. It's about what they might be worth in 25 years' time with a football brand the equivalent of Chelsea. So we've now got a situation where, and I think we might see it in the next few days with Aston Villa. Aston Villa are probably short on PSR by a meaningful amount. Okay, they will have a choice. Do they sell a footballer, or do they do an internal transfer of the women's team? Well, I think they'll probably go for the women's team.
Well, it's a no-brainer, right?
Well, it's not a complete no-brainer, because, of course, the paradox is that if everybody is right and the women's game in 2050 is going to be enormous, comparable to the size of the men's game in terms of value, all of the value now it's going off to the private equity owners.
Yeah, that's my point.
Right now, every other team except for Chelsea will benefit from the value of the women's game in 2050, except for Chelsea. Yeah. So in many ways, Chelsea men's club is now at a disadvantage if they're right about the future value of the women's game.
The flip side to that is, in order to achieve what Chelsea might be able to achieve as an entity going forward, they've needed to front end some of their investment if their mentality is to be deployed, and they've sucked all the value out of the women's team to drop it into this equation to be able to give themselves a valuation in 5 years' time of the bigger project.
Well, except that none of it's real, because it's paper profits.
Oh,
okay,
absolutely.
So really, all that it's allowed them to do moving the women's team, it's not changed the amount of money that's actually in Chelsea men's or Chelsea women's. Okay, they've raised a small amount of external capital, so they have got that. That is that is additional capital
And that
that's
was
coming
by
from the
selling
outside.
a certain percentage of it to another investor.
8%, I think it was, to actually a very good investor.
Yes.
A guy another guy with incredible success. We shouldn't. They've got a collection of billionaires and people that have been extremely successful, far more successful than I am, in terms of seeing the vision of a business. The guy started Reddit. He's a billionaire, right? He may well be right that the women's game in 2050 is comparable to the men's game in 2025. He might be right. But in terms of what they've done and why they've done it, it's hard to see that they've done it for proper commercial reasons. It looks to us from the outside as being very simply about moving the profit into Chelsea men's team to get round the PSR issue that they have.
But the interesting thing about valuations, and then Stefan is absolutely right, and it's interesting because I've written articles about the women's game and the fact that there's an investment community that believes that there's a huge opportunity in women's football, stripping it away from necessarily the structure that it currently exists in and making it an independent entity in its own right, and then investing in it because the opportunity is there. But when you've got Chelsea selling their women's team for 250 million, you've sucked all the value out at this moment in time. But who would have said 15 years ago that Chelsea would have been bought for £2.5 billion, that Man United would be in the ballpark of £5 billion? So if you look at the potential opportunities in this space, there's no reason to believe that in 10, 15 years' time, Chelsea might not be worth £15 billion as an entity. And the cost implications of getting them there and the moving around of opportunity within the confines of a framework to achieve it, ends justifies the means.
We talked a bit about PSR being dead, but there is still sort of a question mark as to who is healthy in that regard and who is not. So what is the current situation, and who? I think you've mentioned Aston Villa already. Have got to quickly do some sort of transaction. So who else in that situation?
Yeah, well, look, the starting point is who was close last year. Okay, so we know those clubs because we saw what they did at the close of the PSR window, as it's now known, on 30th of June. So we know Aston Villa scrambled around. Chelsea did a few deals, but it was a different type of scrambling because, of course, they were selling their women's team for £200 million. So that solved all of the PSR problems for them. Newcastle, we know, scrambled around. They've talked about it extensively since. And then, so that's the starting point. Those are the main clubs. Then the other club that's highlighted that they might have an issue is Wolverhampton Wanderers, because Wolverhampton Wanderers moved their accounting year end from the 31st of May, which would have meant that any sales that occur in June were in the 25-26 year. They moved their year end from 31st of June into 31st of May to 30th of June, which meant that the Kuna transaction goes into the PSR test for the current season, which means that they probably had an issue, because otherwise why would you move your accounting year end? But of course, if you are selling Kuna for £62.5 million, plus actually we found out in the United accounts approximately another £8 million of agent fees and other intermediary fees, just so people get a feel for the scale of some of these transactions. But if they've sold that player, then we know that they're okay. So, but really the one to focus on is Aston Villa out of that group, because of course Aston Villa had a decent season, but also invested very heavily. So we know that the starting point was that their running costs were very, very high relative to their revenue. They did about £70 million from the Champions League, so great boost to their revenue on that score, and also will have done very considerable amounts of money on match day, because we know that some of their ticket prices got up to £100 for some of those Champions League games, and they had 6 or 7, I think probably 6 by the time you get to a quarter final. So 6 big home games on top. So they'll have made very, very good money from that. But the problem is they invested very heavily. So they would have had significant bonuses payable in those wage packets for their players. And then on top of that, we know what they did in January in terms of they bought a couple of players, and on top of that, they loaned a couple of players.
Jim White and Simon Jordan. Monday to Friday mornings from 10 on AM, on DAB, via the talkSPORT app and on your smart speaker. talkSPORT.